Hello, my name's Hugh Salvesen. I'm a Scottish Blue Badge tourist guide based here in Edinburgh. And I'd like to thank my colleagues Mike and Joe for inviting me to take part in their Hidden Corners project. I'm talking to you today from the Grange Cemetery here in the south side of Edinburgh on this showery, breezy autumn day. This is a big Victorian cemetery laid out in the middle of the 19th century, so it has become the last resting place for many thousands of citizens of Edinburgh. Some of them famous, some of them not so famous. When you walk around in this cemetery, as I do often, you see that most of the gravestones have a name, they have a date and possibly a place of birth, they have a date and possibly a place of death, and usually, interestingly, they have a profession. So you know that this person was a minister of the Church of Scotland, or this person was an eminent professor at the university, or possibly someone who'd retired to Edinburgh after an illustrious career in the colonial civil service in some part of empire. But this stone, the one we're going to be focusing on today, doesn't say very much at all. It simply has a name, a date of death, and an age from which one can deduce the date of birth. But it doesn't say who he was, and what he did, and why he has this splendid red granite slab as a gravestone on the wall of the cemetery. The reason it doesn't say who he was and what he did is because everybody knew who he was and what he did. At the time of this man's death, he was famous. And the funeral cortege that brought him to this place in the last days of 1856 was one of the largest that Edinburgh has ever seen. There were thousands of people who came out to say farewell to Hugh Millar. So who was he? He was born in 1802, that's the arithmetic, in the village of Cromarty. Cromarty is a small village in the north of Scotland, northeast, at the very end of the promontory called the Black Isle, which stretches out north of Inverness. His father was a seaman, and he died at sea when his ship sank, when Hugh was only 5. He didn't have much of a formal education, because he was quite an argumentative little boy, and when he left school, he finally got his first job as an apprentice to a stonemason at the age of 17. This brings us to the first great theme of his life: rocks. In the course of his work, he had to go to quarries to find raw material for the stonemason's yard, and he became fascinated by the rocks, the rock formations, the geology which he saw in the quarries, and the fossils which were embedded in these rocks. And on his days off, he would go for long, long walks along the shoreline of the Black Isle, collecting rocks and fossil specimens. And within a few years, he had amassed a considerable collection. But it wasn't all good, because he contracted silicosis from inhaling the stone dust from the mason's yard. No face mask for him. So he had to stop that job, and he went to work in a bank. In the bank, he had a more sedentary job, and this is the beginning of the second great theme of his life: religion. This was at the time when there was a great debate going on in the Church of Scotland about the apparently arcane question of who should appoint the ministers in each parish. Some people said it should be the landowner, designating the minister as a kind of act of patronage, top down. Other people said the minister should be elected by the congregation, bottom up. Hugh Millar was a devout Christian man, and he was a fervent exponent of the latter argument. He believed that the minister should be elected. So he took to writing about this, writing letters to the newspapers and periodicals. And in no time at all, these letters and articles had attracted the attention of people here in Edinburgh. And in 1840, he was invited to come and take the job as editor of The Witness, a periodical, a magazine, published here in Edinburgh on the High Street. he took the job, he moved to Edinburgh, now married, and lived here for the rest of his life. And if you come to Edinburgh, you can see a plaque next to where the witness offices used to be, next door to the city chambers. He hadn't been here for very long when he made the acquaintance of some of the most eminent geologists and paleontologists in Scotland. And he was astonished to meet these people because he, a man with no academic credentials and little by way of formal education, realised that he knew actually quite as much about rocks and fossils as these distinguished professors from the university. So this encouraged him to start writing about geology and fossils. And it led to the publication of his first of 3 books on the subject. The following year, after he arrived in Edinburgh, 1841, he wrote a book called The Old Red Sandstone, and it became one of the best-selling books on the subject in the 19th century. And he started using the columns of The Witness not only to write about church politics, this question of the appointment of ministers, but also to write about geology. But still, it didn't end well. He was depressive. Some people said he was psychotically depressive, and he became increasingly afflicted by by mental illness, so much so that on the night of 24 December 1856, he shot himself, and he died of his wounds the following day, Christmas Eve 1856. Why did he do that? Well, some people think it is no coincidence that the very last thing he did before he pulled the trigger was finish correcting the proofs of his first book, which was an attempt to write about both rocks and religion. It was called The Testimony of the Rocks. It was about both geology and theology. It was an attempt to reconcile his Christian beliefs, his wish to believe in the literal truth of the book of Genesis, with the evidence he had accumulated through his own scientific investigations. Maybe it was impossible to reconcile those two things. He was not the only man at that time who struggled to reconcile traditional Christian beliefs with 19th century science. The book was published shortly after his death, The Testimony of the Rocks, but it was not a success, and it and so many books like it were swept away 3 years later in 1859 when Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species and changed the way we think about the evolution of the planet forever. Was he a failure? I don't think so. If you go to Cromarty, and I encourage you to do so, you can see that his birthplace and the house next door have been turned into a museum telling the story of his life and work. They're run by the National Trust for Scotland. And this collection of fossils, which he assembled, over 6,000 of them, became the core of the geological collection at the National Museum of Scotland, which you can see here in Edinburgh to this day. And there are also his books. He liked to say to people that they should make the right use of their eyes. He wanted people to look carefully. He encouraged people to see. And in a way, that is his epitaph. In a way, those words should also be on this gravestone. Thank you very much for watching.